Welcome. I'm Sister Who. I was trying to think of an illustrative sort of story to tell the other day, and just looking around, it was snowing that particular day, and it's snowing today actually as we're videotaping this, but I got to thinking about the story, what would be the experience of a drop of water that comes to Earth as a snowflake, and what happens as the seasons pass and the changes it goes through, the things it encounters. And imagining being this very small piece of something sitting up in the sky, a bit of water vapor actually, but having nothing solid around you, nothing that you can point to, nothing concrete, just sort of floating there, and you experience light and darkness and temperature changes, and at some point as it gets colder there's a growth in size and a growth in heaviness, and you begin to fall, and this little water droplet turning into a snowflake, and where it had been falling rather fast at first, now is falling a little more gently, but falling for a very long time, having no idea what's going on as it's passing from one world into the next, or so I must so imagine it would feel. Finally seeing something concrete in the distance, having never seen something concrete before. Basically the ground below as it gets closer. And as it gets closer, and then it seems to be coming so fast, and I suppose it could be rather frightening having something rushing up at you that fast and not having any understanding of parachutes or anything like that. And then the point of impact, and what happens to a snowflake when it impacts, whether that a six-sided crystal is broken in some way, or whether a single large six-sided crystal is suddenly reduced to numerous very small six-sided crystals, or just what happens in that impact and that breaking as it makes contact with Earth for the first time. And lying there and then having others fall on top of it until there's a great weight, and being compacted there and not moving for a very long time. And as the seasons begin to change, finally melting and becoming water that runs either into the ground or into the ground and through the ground and somehow winds up in a small river. And then the journey of that little drop of water within the context of this rushing river as it travels many, many miles before reaching the ocean, and all the things that happen along the way. I mean, it's kind of like a life experience in a lot of wonderfully metaphorical ways. The point, I guess, that really caught my attention was imagining this point of awareness, this water drop as a person, swept along with all the other water drops in this river, going through a rocky section of rapids, and occasionally being slammed into a rock, and by that impact being thrown high into the air again, and then falling back into the water. And how, in some sense, that experience might be frightening, it might be painful, but it's also, for a brief moment, returning that little drop of water to the sort of environment that it knew so long ago before it fell to the earth, of being surrounded by nothing but air. And there's something ancient that it tries to remember in that experience. And perhaps it begins to understand that the rock in the river can be a painful point of contact, but it can also be something that momentarily at least gives that drop of water the power of flight. And then it falls back to where all the other water drops are, and maybe some of them don't believe in such a thing as flight because they haven't had that experience. And maybe they laugh and deride this particular little drop of water for talking of such things. And yet, the drop of water knows they're real, but he has no language to convince or communicate the experience to the others. And sometimes they go around rocks, and sometimes they go around woods, sometimes they soak through muddier portions, sometimes they stir up the sand as they dance their way down to the ocean. And in looking at this, I tried to go back again and think, so what parallels here? And as I understand the process of life for each person, there's something that we hardly even remember, of some spiritual point that was each of us before it came into this world. Perhaps a wishful intention in the mind or in the heart of our parents, perhaps something of a more spiritual nature, existing outside of earth, in some other place, in some other way. And this point of energy, this point of awareness that doesn't really know anything and has no experience, and then it begins to fall away from this quiet, calm place where it simply exists into a hard world of sharp edges, of different sorts of materials, some soft and some sharp and some hard, some cold and some warm. And there may be some that go through that change with anticipation and eagerness, expecting an adventure. And I imagine there are also many who go through that sort of change with a great deal of fear, with a great deal of wondering whether they will survive this transition. And what is this transition that they're going through anyway? They don't even understand it. It's simply happening to them. And whether to make sense or whether to simply not ask to make sense of the experience and simply to go through it and see what it will teach and what it will show, and with what it will bring this particular point of awareness, this particular person into contact. What will we meet along the way as we're falling to earth, in a sense? And then getting closer to earth and going through this coldness and taking on a body, taking on a form, even as the water becomes a snowflake, a specific combination of branches, of limbs, of arms and legs and fingers, specific, in our case, a specific hair color, a specific gender, a specific orientation, all sorts of things that we don't hang on to forever, but for a certain part of the journey seem to describe us. And then approaching this point of making contact with the earth, this point where everything becomes very physical and very real, and the floating and the flying and the primary experience of spirit and of air stops. And suddenly when we jump, we don't go that high anymore. For a time, we're tied in some sense by the force of gravity to the earth. And trying to remember what it was like, but somehow in that impact of meeting with an earthly life, it's like it's been knocked out of our hands and we can't quite grasp it. But there's no way to go back. So it's kind of one of those things, I guess, that the only way out of the situation is through it. And sometimes it really hurts. There are impacts, there are changes, there are transitions that we don't know whether we'll survive. And if we do, then the journey continues. And if we don't, I suppose that's a whole nother thing to consider with all the possible what-ifs. I think sometimes the process of birth is often spoken of as a very miraculous sort of thing. sometimes I think we forget the experience that this new person, that the child is having through the birth, that it's a scary, painful, possibly even traumatic experience for this new person. I read an article once in which someone described someone being born in words that sounded like someone being rushed to the emergency room of a local hospital with a heart attack. And when they finally concluded the article by saying that this person had just been born, and I went back, yeah, the description used very much fit the process of birth, but it was exactly the terrifying sort of thing of someone who would be afraid they were about to die and would suddenly find out whether there was a heaven and what it was like and what God really is like, and if there's really a guardian angel to see you through to the other side and so forth, where it would not be just an idea, but it would be an experiential reality. And the process of birth and the process of death have a lot in common that way, because they're both very, very dramatic transitions, and transitions about which it's very difficult to be certain of anything. And in the in-between time, there's this unseen force of gravity that keeps our physical bodies more or less tied to the earth, and a force that must be satisfied by some other understanding, some other force, before it will ever let go. And in the same way, being alive demands something of each of us as we experience things, and we can't run away from them. And we can't stop feeling what we feel, and we can't stop knowing what we know, and we can't stop being who we are. But it doesn't always make sense. I mean, there isn't, there's not a way to be certain of how to deal with the concrete situation we're facing. One person may learn to run very fast, and in running very fast has the sensation of wind all around. And it gives a little bit of reminder of that time when they weren't tied down by gravity. Another person, perhaps the Wright brothers, would venture into science and come up with ideas of aerodynamics and speed and lift and all sorts of other forces, creating an airplane. A mechanical external force that sort of brings us back in touch a little bit with that feeling of flying, and sort of pulls us away from the limitations of gravity. And there are all sorts of other ways too. People who do skydiving, people who do bungee jumping. I think there's something subconscious that we're trying to get at in all that, and it's a memory. It's a feeling of being with that which is God before entering this life. And as an expression of divine love, entering this life and wondering whether this is really divine love. If you really love someone, if you would really send them to a world like this with all of its challenges and problems and such. I once spoke with, several months ago, spoke with a friend who it seemed we both were at least open to the idea of having past lives in other places, and believing that a person could have lived in some other form on some other planet somewhere, and that sort of process is still going on. And I guess what I appreciate most about that way of thinking is that it allows me to consider things that wouldn't be possible under other systems. And he made the comment, I don't know whether it was serious or if it was in jest, but he made the comment that there were souls all across the universe lining up for their turn to be born onto Earth, into humanity, because it was so hard here. And I laughed. In one, it's kind of a paradox, I suppose. In one sense, it makes sense, because there's so much we learn by these things. And on the other hand, having the experience of it, too often I'm inclined to look in the mirror and go, why would anyone choose this? uh, a world where families don't necessarily love each other, where people get married for all sorts of bizarre reasons, where those with wonderful creative insights and ideas and understanding aren't necessarily given an opportunity to share that with anyone. Composers, musical composers and painters who created magnificent things and really weren't recognized until long after they were gone. And I suppose we could wonder if, in spirit form, if they recognized, if they somehow knew it 200 years later when someone found their work and loved it, really, really loved it. Do they know? Does it matter whether they know? I think perhaps the composers, the musical composers composed music because that was what was within them to do. I think there are some composers who have composed music and songs because they were asked to, but there are far more who composed it simply because it was within their heart to do it. It's like the writer who says, "I write because I have to." It doesn't really make sense to someone who doesn't have that sort of inner calling, I suppose. I suppose it's like me being Sister Who. Why am I Sister Who? I suppose because on some spiritual subconscious level I feel I have to be. It's something within me that will not be quiet and that will not go away. And so I do my best to make it something good, to make it something that teaches and blesses and helps as many other people as possible. And there are things about this sort of calling that are burdensome, and things about it that are difficult, and things that bring painful experiences. And there are also things about it that bring blessing and empowerment. But I don't think I ever really made a choice as to whether to be Sister Who or not, any more than I ever made a choice as to whether to be gay or not, or whether to be in love with the life partner that I have or not. We met, and he wasn't what I was looking for, and I suppose I was what he was looking for. And somehow, after we got to know each other, we just knew it wouldn't be right to walk away. But I don't know that there's an easy or a real justifiable explanation for it. And life does often include things like that, things that defy explanation, things that are not easily explained, and yet things that somehow we know have to be there and have to be as they are. And we do whatever we can with them. And there are difficult experiences that come along, like the water drop going through the rapids. And getting slammed into a rock. And it hurts, and yet it is immediately followed by this sensation of flight and this stirring of very old memories of what it must have been like. And then before the water drop can really completely remember, it falls back into the water. And in some sense, I suppose, it hopes for another rock to fall into, to slam against, so that it can return to that experience of flight. But the other quirk about that experience of flight is that it separates it from the other water. As it's experiencing flight, it's separated from the mainstream, quite literally, of other water droplets. And even so, there are artists and philosophers and theologians, and probably each one of us at some point, some for longer stretches of period of time, some for just brief moments, in which we experience something and we think we remember something, and it separates us from others because we know it's not something that we have any way of expressing to them. It's something that goes beyond our language skills, something that we can't think of the right word for, something that we know others won't believe or won't accept or won't like. But it's unavoidably part of our experience, and therefore part of who and what we are, each of us individually. And so life is this challenge. And I try to think in whatever a daily life's experience brings, and whatever rock I'm slammed into, whatever difficult adjustment I'm asked to make, whatever thing I experience that I find myself horrendously frustrated trying to communicate to someone else. Whatever means of empowerment and of creative blessing I would really, really like to share with others, that somehow I just can't find the right words. And the packaging, a dress, a costume, being a person who's gay, whatever packaging it comes in, this experience of life that I have, that there are people who cannot accept it and do not see the blessing that it will bring if they simply listen and look. And it's not that any of us is to imitate each other or to copy one another, but there is a sense in which we can all be together like a river and create this enormous music, this rushing sound, this dance of water droplets into the air. Together we can do that. One little water droplet running along a riverbed by itself will not have the momentum or the ability to find a rock from which to fly. It needs the support, the momentum, the speed, the encouragement of the rest of the river in order to reach that point, which makes it seem wonderfully paradoxical that the river encourages, makes possible the water droplet's flight, and then does not accept or understand or receive it when it returns to tell of it. Interesting paradox. It's like on a subconscious level, we're empowering each other to be more than we've ever dreamed we could be. And the minute we do it, it's so unfamiliar we don't know how to receive the very thing we've created. In the town I grew up in, there was a lot of unspoken social pressure to conform to popular norms, to be like everybody else. And without having made any decision whatsoever, I just found I could never do that. And there's a sort of a painful abusiveness to the rejection of the things I understood and the ways I understood. And so it hurts, and it would be real easy for me to speak very badly of the town I grew up in, and yet somehow those forces conspired to create a person that turned out to be me. And there are so many variables in that equation that I don't know that anyone could ever completely explain it or completely understand how to vary the process. We're talking about millions of variables all coming together into a very unique, very specific experience. But here in Billings, each of us has a very unique, very individual experience also. But we're going to create a lot more music, and we're going to allow a lot more of us to fly into fascinating experiences. If we give thanks for things, and if we welcome them back, no matter how preposterous the report may seem. The report that any water droplet brings back of what it's like to fly doesn't change the course of the river, and it doesn't change anything about the river. But I think if we listen, and if we try to understand using our imaginations, using poetry, using the language of the spirit more than the language of the body. I think spiritually and mentally and emotionally we become so much more, and it becomes like the music of the rushing river that can be heard for miles in various directions, depending on the land that surrounds it. And so when someone new comes along through the school system, a particularly young person you may meet, someone you meet in a shopping mall, and they seem very different, I'd be willing to bet there's some buried treasure there. There's an experience that may be totally foreign, but totally fascinating, and in that, very empowering. Something that gives us new ways of looking at things, new ways of understanding things, new questions to ask, new ways of understanding what it is to be a man, what it is to be a woman, what it is to be a person, irrespective of gender. What it means to show someone that you love them, what it means to get along with someone you disagree with, what it means to respect someone's radically different opinion of how society should be organized and how it should interact. In every moment of contact, though, there is both a lesson to learn and a ministry to perform. There is a way of empowering the person you're speaking with, and in doing so, also empowering yourself, and thereby empowering the community in which you live to create wonderfully beautiful, incredible things that perhaps no one's seen so far. Thank you for joining me.